It's my pleasure to introduce Dave Wilkins as your lunchtime keynote speaker. Dave's been a good friend to Charlotte ASTD. He's presented at many chapter meetings, and Dave's also presented at previous Day of Learning events, so you might recognize his name or recognize his face. So Dave, thank you for being back and joining us. Dave's been a thought leader in the social enterprise and human capital industries for more than 20 years. The development of award-winning simulation technology, LMS solutions, social collaboration offerings. He's pioneered many innovative approaches to solve common workplace challenges, such as employee productivity and performance, recruiting and retention, and corporate communications. Dave's an active speaker at industry technology conferences and has written articles for CLO Magazine, Training Magazine, and Talent Management Magazine. Dave's also keynoted or chaired major industry events, including the Training and ASTD conferences and the annual HR Metrics Show. Dave's currently the principal leader of the Oracle Sales Academy with responsibilities for platform infrastructure, authoring tools, learning and assessment strategy, and reporting. David, welcome back to ASTD.
You know, I'm fortunate enough to have spoken at a lot of venues over the years, and this one for me has always been one of the most engaging. You sort of get the most thoughtful questions, so I'm sort of really excited to have been invited back. So thank you for that. In the past, here and at many other events, I've spoken a lot about social learning, gamification, mobile learning. I think maybe, have you all heard enough about those topics yet? I mean, they're at every conference you go to today, right? And that's good, because they're important subjects. But one of the things that's been on my mind since my time at Taleo, so I was head of research at Taleo, which was a recruiting, performance management, learning management, sort of in that talent management kind of space. My role there as head of research was to look at trends, look at macro conditions that were driving talent issues globally, look at things that were going on in the US. And really since then, I've had a very passionate belief that we're not necessarily aligning ourselves the right way within our organizations. So I'm going to try to talk today about some of the things that I think we should be looking at that are opportunities for us to increase our strategic value and to deliver more value to the businesses that we're part of. So my goals are, you know, I want to really try to help you in your career by thinking differently about what those opportunities are and the ways that you can add value within your business. I want you to maybe see the big picture differently around the talent landscape, and not just the training landscape, but how does the training stuff fit into the larger talent landscape of your business. And then also with just nationally as a citizen, I think we have some real serious challenges in the US right now with structural unemployment, issues related to the lack of training opportunities for people to transfer between careers. And I think there's a role we can play in helping address some of that as well. And then lastly, I just want to ask some tough questions about, you know, sort of where we're going with talent and maybe get us to think, again, just a little bit differently about some of those challenges. So I'm intentionally going to be a little bit provocative and say some things that may push some boundaries, but that's by design. I figure if you're going to like not a keynote, then we can talk about like tactical stuff. But my view is, what I've always enjoyed about keynotes is they sort of they challenge me and try to make me think in different ways. So I'm going to try to do that today. So let me tell you the genesis of some of the thinking that's going to go into this session. Do you remember a few years back when Thailand had massive flooding, right? If you don't, here's a picture of what it looked like, right, you know, on the left there. It wasn't good. Really, the whole country was pretty much underwater. And it completely disrupted the global supply of hard drives, because something like 95% of all hard drives were actually developed and actually manufactured in Thailand. And I remember reading a couple really insightful articles in The Economist and other places that suggested that that disruption in supply was actually really a good thing for Apple. Because Apple at the time they weren't using optical drives, they were using solid state drives in all of their devices. So while people would go to the store to go buy a Dell, they couldn't buy a Dell because they had a supply disruption. They literally weren't on the shelves, but they could buy an iPad, right? And so for those people who were on the fence about whether they should go one way or the other, there was an opportunity to buy one, but not the other. So that then, you know, fostered a question in my head when I was the head of Taleo Research, like, what does that mean for talent at Dell and some of these other manufacturers? And what it suggested to me, and what they ultimately then said publicly, is that supply disruption accelerated their plans to move to solid state technologies, right? It put a bug in everybody to say, okay, we were gonna go there in 18 months, we gotta do it in 12. Well, what does that mean? Do we have the capability to do it in 12? Who knows? Who knows what capabilities we have internally on a global basis to make that determination? If we don't, what should we do next? Can we hire the right talent in to make up for our capability deficit? Is there enough ramp and time to train people to overcome the capability deficit? Can we partner? Do we acquire? Right? These are the questions that businesses face, and I think we can play a role in helping to provide more insight and have more actionable strategies at our disposal to address some of those things. At the same time, and perhaps more recently, you also see massive technology disruption happening today. So anybody know what this thing is on the left of the picture? 3D printer. Raise your hand, yes? Nicely done. Don, why am I not surprised? Don Miller, 3D printer, of course. It's actually modeled. I made a wrench this morning with mine. Yeah, so 3D printers, like completely disrupting the manufacturing industry, right? I mean, we're only at the beginning of this wave, but mark my words, I'm sure you've heard it from other people, but mark my words too, this will disrupt manufacturing as we know it today. Completely, utterly. There is literally, are you guys familiar with the baby stroller? It's the blue one, it's like super expensive. What's it called? The Bob. Yeah, thank you. I have a Bob, I just forgot the name of it because my kids are older now. So you know, when you get replacement parts for the Bob, it's like crazy expensive. If you've ever had to get a replacement part for the Bob. So some dude out in the Midwest got a 3D printer, and he was like, you know what, the hell with this. I am not gonna pay the prices for these parts. And he modeled the part with CAD, and now when other people have their parts break, he sells them the part directly at like 1/3 the cost. He made himself a side business making spare parts for Bobs, right? This is the kind of stuff that's gonna happen. How about the thing on the far right? Anybody know what that is? That's a robot pharmacist. So in a lot of large medical facilities, they have replaced the in-house pharmacy personnel with pharmacy robots. They're 1,000 times less likely to make a mistake. They're available 24/7. The initial expense usually gets paid back in somewhere between 6 months to a year because of the high cost you pay for pharmacists. You get your payback pretty quickly. But boy, that's interestingly disruptive for pharmacists, isn't it? Right? Right? Just like the 3D printing is sort of interestingly disruptive for people in manufacturing. What's the thing in the middle? Watson. Anybody know what they've done with Watson since the Jeopardy win against Jennings? Medical and now financial, right? So for those of you that don't know the story, I'll just give you the quick synopsis. Watson is a supercomputer built by IBM. It famously went on Jeopardy and beat the reigning Jeopardy champion, which people thought was a major advance in AI because of the speed and the response times that it was actually able to do in real time. But the challenge there is scanning through multiple possible answers and then sort of stack ranking the most likely one and then putting that forth in a very quick time frame. They've since applied that technology to healthcare to do diagnoses. So put in all the different symptoms and all the background on the patient, and then it rips through, oh, here's a stack rank of the top 5 most likely things wrong with that individual as a guide to doctors to help them more effectively diagnose patients. Now they've branched into financial stuff as well to look at your portfolio and look at potential investment opportunities and basically replacing financial advisors. So again, very disruptive to people, but all these things are also very disruptive to business, right? Which change the landscape for what talent I need, what sort of things I can do with my talent, right? Maybe I don't need a doctor in the way I used to need a doctor before. Maybe I need a healthcare advisor who's going to take the advice of this and evaluate whether which of those things are the most likely cause of my symptoms by ordering some tests. But that's not the same as meeting with a doctor, right? So they disrupt the talent landscape and your talent planning. And then, of course, you have all the things that businesses normally do in response to competitor moves, new market opportunities, you know, 15 years ago, who would have thought that one of the best sources of talent today for programming, technical skills, engineering skills would be where? Eastern Europe. Just go back in time. Think it's not a long time. 15, 20 years ago. Eastern Europe was still pretty much a disaster area, right? If you go back far enough, there was still a wall there. But right after that, it was just a mess. It was like a third world country, but they had a highly educated population, and very rapidly, they're now becoming part of the global environment. I have teammates in Romania. We leverage Romanian assets all the time, and we're constantly looking for new pools of talent in that area because they're very highly educated in a lot of cases, and they're underemployed against their skill set in their region, right? But it's changed the way we think about talent and development. So in that context, how many of you today can accurately describe the current attrition levels at your company, current turnover levels? Raise your hand. Like 7 of you in the room. Okay. How many of you can accurately describe the attrition rate for your critical roles? Maybe 6 of you, 5 of you, a couple of you dropped off there, I think. And what about things like cost of hire or time to hire for critical roles? Okay, a couple more fell off on that one. So one of the questions that I think we need to start asking ourselves is, if we did a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats for our business, one of the interesting things is if you step away, one of our internal competitors is recruiting, right? Because we have a choice. Do we develop our people or do we hire in people that already have the existing expertise? Have you ever thought about it that way? Right, we just let recruiting do its thing. But recruiting costs a ton of money, a ridiculous amount of money. And it doesn't necessarily deliver the results that people want. So one thing we might want to start thinking about is, if one of our competitors for time, resources, treasure internally is the recruiting department, maybe we should start learning more about what's going wrong with recruiting today and how we can position ourselves to be a better alternative internally to strengthen our strategic position and drive more strategic value. So to that end, how many of you think you have a pretty good handle on the critical roles in your company? Hands? Which roles drive your company's success? I think that was the same 7 or 8 people. A few more folks joined in, okay? How about those of you who know the critical roles, how many of you know the key capabilities that are required to deliver successfully in that critical role? I'm not seeing a lot of hands. So you heard the CLO panel earlier talking about the importance of getting connected to the business. This is one of the best ways to get connected to the business. What are those roles that make your business work? And how well are we developing a pipeline of those people and getting them the skills and the capability they need to succeed? If the answer is not very well, then the alternative is always going to be hire those people externally, right? Because we won't have the pipeline internally to do that. One of the things we need to do is figure out what is the career path that people follow to get to a critical role? What are the critical skills, experiences, job rotations that it takes for them to get to that point? We'll talk more about why in a minute. What about workforce planning stuff? How many of you are involved in workforce planning discussions as it relates to changes in strategic direction, acquisitions, new geographies you're planning to penetrate? How many of you are privy to those conversations today? Maybe 3 or 4 people in the room. How many of you think that you should be privy to those conversations? Okay. If your hand's not going up, you're in the wrong room. You should probably, there's an insurance conference, a couple. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we can't model the things that we need to develop training against unless we understand where the business is going. Here's a more radical thought. Should the business be going in that direction without a clear understanding of the talent that it's going to take to do it? We want to open shop in Poland. That's awesome. How many employees do we have that speak Polish today? How many employees do we have who are willing to relocate? Do we have enough critical depth in the roles we have here to staff facilities there without disrupting our existing practices here? How far off are we to spin up new capabilities and teams that have the expertise we need so that we can push them to Poland? If we hold off 2 years, can we grow enough talent to fully staff that? What's our time horizon? Executives should not be making these decisions in a vacuum. They need help. And as you heard from the CLO panel, increasingly, CLOs are not just managing the learning stuff. They're intimately tied into talent and competency modeling and capability modeling and performance assessment, which means we actually now have the pieces to put it all together and say, based on our performance reviews and our competency models, here are the skills that we have. Here are the skills we think we need against the strategic initiative. Oh my gosh, here's the gap. How should we solve for the gap? What training do we need to put in place today to help us be ready strategically for that next phase or that next initiative we're pursuing? Does that make sense? And it's not just me saying this stuff, right? So I mean, Ernst & Young just this year came out with what are the top business challenges in the world? You know, number 3, business challenges, not talent challenges. What are the top business challenges? Number 3 was managing talent. Said, you know, 20% of companies report that people with the right skill sets are simply not available. You know, they attribute it to educational stuff. I think they're off base. I think there's more factors that are going into it today, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But that's the reality, and that's a good reality. If you go to China or Japan, or you look at particular markets, you know, Taleo, when I was there, we had an open position for a web designer in the San Francisco area for 12 months. 12 months. During a time period when there was 11% unemployment. Well, what the hell's going on there? It's called skills mismatch. We'll talk more about that, but it's a big challenge. So this is not a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, and it's hugely on the minds of executives. Last year, or 2 years ago now, I guess, Lloyd's of London does an annual risk analysis, where they do a risk index. The number 1, tied for number 1 globally, was talent and skill shortages on the minds of CEOs. They had 500 choices to pick from. Market volatility, like things related to taxation, things related to government interventions. Number 1 was talent and skill shortages. This year it's dropped a little bit. Other things have taken to the fore. Government intervention and regulation. I have no idea why that would have come up, but it's come up. And then when you look at the drivers, you know, the number one driving talent risk, shortage of personnel with necessary skills, right? So again, so I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about why, because I want to try to convince you that these issues are systemic and they're not going away. There's a tendency among some economists to think that this weird period where we're in, where companies are doing really, really well and unemployment is still really, really high, is some anomaly. And I think they're totally missing the boat, frankly. And I'm going to sort of make a case for why I think they're missing the boat. And in making that case, I'm giving you the ammunition to make a case for yourselves in actually positioning learning as an alternative to the current strategy, which is hiring, okay? And along the way, as we talk about hiring for critical roles, just keep in the back of your head that reskilling is the exact same thing. So the title of this was not a misnomer. You know, if you can solve for hiring for a critical role, you're simultaneously solving for reskilling people. It's the same problem. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So why are we seeing skill shortages? Well, I'm going to talk about an obvious one, a less obvious one, and a totally not obvious one. All right, so we'll go in order for the easiest one. Oh my gosh, baby boomers are retiring. Woo! Is anybody shocked by that? No, I'm just kidding. How long have we been talking about this? Seriously, like forever. So I will just throw a couple of nuances at this one, right? So, you know, we like to think, oh my God, baby boomers are retiring, US problem. Wrong. We're actually doing pretty good. Look at the numbers, right? In Russia, over the 2010 to 2020, there's going to be an 8% decrease in their working population. In Germany, it's -4. In Poland, you know, in Italy. I mean, these countries have fewer workers at the end of 2020 than they did at the beginning of 2010. Their workforce has actually declined. By comparison, our workforce is going to grow by 14%. So as scary as the baby boomer retirement thing is, our economy and our population is at least still moving forward as opposed to shrinking. So just keep in mind that nuance. It's not like we're in a vacuum as the countries in Europe are trying to figure out what the heck do we do with the fact that our workforce population just decreased, they're going to go to all the same pools we go to, Eastern Europe, India, South America. And so all of a sudden this competition for talent that we're sort of always been talking about is going to heat up significantly because we got to get these people from someplace. So just one little nuance. Here's another little nuance. This shows the labor participation rate for people by age. So this shouldn't be a shocker. When you're young, you're not in the workforce yet. When you're middle-aged, you're in the workforce. And when you get old, you drop out of the workforce. Right? It's not exactly rocket science, right? So this shows you what the normal distribution of labor force participation rates look like. And that's pretty typical. So it looks like, oh my gosh, everybody retires when they get to retirement age. But if you look more recently, and these trends have continued. I only grabbed the time series up to 2007, up to 2005 on the other one. But the trends have, if anything, accelerated. So we can go look at, if you want, Bureau of Labor Statistics does all this stuff, by the way. So if you want to go track this stuff yourself, you can. So on the left, it shows basically how are people age 65 and over working. So you can see there was a pretty dramatic shift in the last 10 years or so where they were mostly doing part-time work previously, and now they're all working full-time. Part of that's health. People are much healthier later in life. Part of it's, oh my God, my entire retirement income went up in smoke when the stock market crashed and my house value went in the toilet, and now I have to work, right? And part-time isn't cutting it anymore. Now I have to work full-time. And you can also see that while participation rates in general for the older population still have that downward slope, within the downward slope, they're actually trending up. Right? If you were to back out from the time series or go more detailed over the last 10 years, what you would see is more and more people over the age of 62 are participating in the workforce. And you can see it even more dramatically here. So on the far left side is a 16 to 17-year-old age bracket, and on the far right is 75 and older with the expected distribution in between. So basically what's happening is because older people's retirement income just went away, they stayed in the workforce. So let's just think about that for a second. In a relatively static economy, if more older people stay in the workforce, what do we think is going to happen to the younger people? Will they have unprecedentedly high unemployment? Yes, they will. Shocking. Weird how that works. So labor participation rates among people who are teenagers and people under the age of 26 are literally at an all-time low since this stuff's been measured in the history of the United States, which causes all kinds of interesting ramifications a few years from now. When grandma finally does retire, when her 401k is back up and her house price and she can actually retire. So she retires. Now we're finally going to hire Johnny, right, who's 27. And the only job he's ever had has been flipping burgers, even though he's got a 4-year degree that he's actually never used, right? So now we're going to have like this younger, weird cohort of people who are 27, but have the work experience of like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old, right? Which is really challenging. So this, in case you're curious, here's the actual unemployment numbers by age. 16 to 19-year-olds just aren't working anymore. I mean, when I was a kid, I knew everybody worked at that age. And if you look at studies about talent, it turns out that there's a strong correlation between working as a teenager and staying employed as an adult. Very strong correlation. 20 to 24-year-olds, huge challenge. In fact, it's really sad. If you look at the numbers, the blue line is March of 2012. The red line is March of 2013. For those poor kids aged 20 to 24, their unemployment actually edged up a little bit. They're the only group that happened to. It's a bad time. So that's really difficult, but then you throw into the mix, we don't really train these guys, right? So when you look at all other developed countries, 29 major countries in the world, all part of the OECD, the US ranks dead last on work-based skills training, on the stuff that you learn on the job. Dead last. When you look at work by Peter Capelli, in 1979, young US workers got 2.5 weeks of training per year on average. By 1995, it was just under 11 hours per year. And in 2011, when Accenture reran a similar study, they found that only 21% of US employees had received any employer training in the last 5 years. Since the time the iPhone came out, 80% of the US population has not been trained by their workplace in any way. It's crazy, crazy numbers. So that's one part of the equation, is we got, older people retiring, taking skills with them. We have younger people coming in who effectively we're not training as well as we should be, and who lack the work experience they need because they're not getting it because they're delaying the entry into the workforce. That is a scary set of circumstances. But throw into the mix, we also are seeing a growing problem with capability mismatch or skill mismatch in the US. So in 2011, US unemployment exceeded 9%. 30% of US companies had positions that were open for more than 6 months. So what does that tell you? It tells you we had a lot of people who need work, we have a lot of companies who need work delivered, but the skill sets don't match. The capabilities aren't there, right? They further go on to estimate that by 2020, the US may have 1.5 million too few workers with college or graduate degrees, and nearly 6 million who have not completed high school. Further evidence of a problem. In the last 10 years, college graduations have only gone up 4.6%. We finally just hit 30% in terms of 4-year college graduate degrees. But in terms of the new jobs created over that 10-year span, 85% of them were for knowledge work, right? So we're growing our college population at a snail's pace, and the jobs that we're creating are all needing a college degree. Again, skills mismatch, right? So when you look at the number of jobs created, it's like 4-point-something million of new jobs require interaction skills, bachelor degree type level capability, and we see negative growth for transactions or production jobs. Manufacturing, making things, working as, I used to be a cashier putting myself through college, right? That's an awesome job. You can't be a cashier today. Half the cashier places are automated. You check it, self-checkout, right? Banking. My girlfriend, when I was in high school, was a bank teller. But there's like 4 bank tellers in, I think, all of my town because the rest of them are ATMs, right? So all these jobs are automating away, which is resulting in a challenge. And further, you can see it when you look at when you look at the current marketplace, what jobs require what kind of education. So you can see back in 1995, there was a much higher percentage of people who could do work with only a primary or secondary education. There's been over a 10% drop in the work that's available for people with that kind of education. So we're starting to see this growing mismatch between the kind of work that we're creating and the kind of skills that we're imparting on students, which puts more pressure on us as employers to start to bridge that gap and to figure out, how do I take somebody with potential but not a lot of expertise or experience and grow them into something? Because really the schools aren't doing it as much as they need to. And the jobs are changing so rapidly that we can't bring people in that have the expertise anyway, because the job we're hiring them for didn't exist 6 months ago. So we have to find a way to think about capabilities and job families and bring people up and hire for potential, and then have capability modeling and career tracks again that help people get into those different needs. Just a couple other quick points, and then we'll switch to what do we do about some of this stuff. So what was the highest level of unemployment we had during the Great Recession? Anybody know? How much?
25.
You're looking at U12 numbers or the U6? Okay, if you're taking U12, that's right. So there's different measures of unemployment, right? There's like the really strict measure the government uses, which fails to factor in people who are marginally attached to the workplace, people who are working part-time who want to work full-time, people who haven't applied to unemployment in the last X number. So that number got up to like 25%. The U6, the official number, was like 10.5%, right? The people who are applying for unemployment every week, the hardcore job seekers, right? Huge number. But what was the highest level of unemployment for people with a bachelor's degree or higher? Different question. Two or three? Close? 5%. What was it for people that only had a high school diploma? Depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 13 and 17%. So when you hear people talk about the polarization of income in the US, there you go. People with a college degree weathered this last recession pretty darn well. People without a college degree got hammered. It's going to take them years to recover. But that's because the jobs that we just created over the last 10 years are all the kind of jobs that need a college degree. The jobs that we automated away or offshored are the kind of jobs that, you know, high school diploma, no problem. I'll replace you with a robot. Or I'll push your job into Romania or India or something. How many recruiters do you think factored this into their strategies? So let me tell you what recruiters do. When they see, oh my God, 10% unemployment, this is what recruiters do. This is actually a true story. So, you know, LinkedIn has this cool feature now where they say the jobs you might be interested in, right? So I got this message like, hey, you might be interested in this job. It looks like it's a good fit for your skills, blah, blah, blah. And this is what the job required. 15 years in a senior role in marketing. Okay, I didn't have that, but whatever, right? So immediately I was like, why did he even flag me? But still I'm interested because this seems like a cool job. Social media managing person, right? Cool, I like that. So 15 years in a senior role in marketing. Now the first thing that went through my head was, wow, I don't have that. And the second thing that went through my head is, how in the world is that relevant? Marketing has changed so ridiculously, so much in the last 5 years that if I had someone who had 15 years experience, I don't know that I'd want to hire them. I mean, unless they could prove to me that they were keeping up with current trends. I don't want some old school push marketing out via pamphlets, you know? We're not in the era of Thomas Paine, right? Like I want, give me a tweet, right? So then they wanted somebody with 10 years of digital marketing. Now keep in mind, this was like 2005 where I got this email, right? And I was like, who are doing digital marketing since 1995? Like no one, right? I mean, like, were you advertising on Usenet boards? Like listservs? Like, what? It's crazy, right? And then 5 years of social media marketing. This was like in 2005 or 6, right? Like Facebook was like a glimmer in somebody's eye. Like Twitter had just been born, right? The iPhone didn't exist, right? And I'm like, what? Like, no one's even thought about using social media for marketing yet. Like, what's wrong with you people? And then, so after all that, right? So I'm like, okay, you just took a pool of people from like a few thousand down to like, I don't even know, someone who's willing to lie, I guess. Like one person, right? One unethical person who could BS their way through your interview, right? Okay, good job. And then they said, experience with the transportation industry a must. I'm like, okay, well there goes that one lying dude. He's out of the picture, right? And then strong preference given for multilingual candidates. And I'm like, oh, come on. Seriously, right? And then MBA candidates preferred. Like, so what they had done is they're looking for what's called the purple squirrel, right? So it's a term. It's actually a term in recruiting. There's actually recruiters who pride themselves on being purple squirrel hunters. I mean, I don't even know why you want that title because it's a weird title, right? But it basically means go find the impossible candidate. Go find the person that no one says exists and go bring them into the company. But that's what recruiters did. They saw 10% unemployment and they went, great. You need to be able to speak German, Middle English, you know? You need to be able to like, you know what? I think someone should be able to speak like Elven, right? I mean, really? So, but that's what happens is there's a disconnect because they're not looking at the real data, right? And their job is to go out and basically be like a salesperson and go bring in people, right? Fill their pipeline of people, and they progress through the thing, and who cares how much that costs to the business, right? And those are the people you're competing with. Because if we're not building the talent pipelines internally to staff our capabilities and our critical roles and our strategic aspirations, then we're going to have to bring them in externally. And that's what's been happening to a large degree. But it's not all that effective a strategy. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. A couple other quick points. The other key aspect of mismatch is geographic mismatch. It's kind of hard to see on this graph, but any place red is a place where we have over 10% unemployment in the US, and any place light colored has less than 5, with gradations in between. But it's sort of interesting because economists look at this and go, like, why is this not a more even distribution? But that's because people aren't willing to move. People aren't willing to leave places of high unemployment and go to places of low unemployment. There's some friction. Largely, I think, this time around, because people couldn't move because their houses were underwater, right? So they were rooted in place. So that was sort of an underlying cause. But they're seeing more and more of that where people just aren't willing to move to jobs. And then the last bit, and I'll briefly touch on this, is structural unemployment. So when the economy imploded, one of the sectors that got hit the hardest was housing. And you saw, there's no housing market anymore. So the construction people got whacked, the plumbers got whacked, electricians got whacked. But the jobs that were getting created were like fracking in North Dakota. Well, that's cool, but I'm a plumber. I can't, okay, what? I can't go do that, right? And so that's called structural unemployment. That's when there's plenty of jobs, but literally the people who have them just have a whole different skill set. Real estate people can't become, petroleum engineers overnight. So this is the bit I was starting to get to, is this sort of final wrinkle. You have these recruiters going out and recruiting purple squirrels. So let me ask you a question. Which do you think costs more? Moving somebody up internally through the ranks or hiring somebody from outside? Outside, correct. Who do you think performs better at the 2-year mark? Internals. So research by Knowledge at Wharton has shown external hires aren't as productive as internal hires. And new research suggests that it takes 2 years for them to get up to speed. External hires average shorter tenures than internal hires. They lower performance scores overall, on average. I also think that hiring external poses a risk to top performers and high potentials internally. Anybody want to guess why? Morale? Morale? Yes. Yes, yes. They're more eager internally to sort of show themselves, and now you've denied them the opportunity, and I hate you so much. For 3 years, I wanted that job, and then you took somebody from the outside, right? So in fact, when you look at the data, lack of career development is the #1 reason for dysfunctional turnover. Training and development opportunities and more opportunities to do what I do best within the business are both tied for #1 drivers of employee engagement. So when you take somebody from the outside, you hit both of those measures at the same time, right? I can't grow in my career because you denied me the opportunity, and I can't do what I do best because I have no opportunity to move into that role. So again, that's Knowledge at Wharton. It's a great little write-up. It's very interesting. But again, in this internal, SWOT of who should be sort of leading the charge for staffing these, open critical roles or reskilling the team when the strategic direction changes, the company default is go hire these people from outside. And yet, the data suggests not the best strategy. Now, there are times, which I probably should allude to, there's plenty of times when you should hire from outside. I mean, you may not lack the critical skills. The timeline to develop them may be too long. You may be going into a new area or a new direction where you don't have the capability in time. I mean, there are absolutely times you need to hire externally. But the default for the steady state should be to grow those people up internally. There's also another factor. By the way, one of the reasons it costs so much is it's related to the fact that you need a proxy for potential. So when you're hiring somebody, you don't know what their potential is. So when you hire from the outside, what do you look for? You look for credentialing, right? Oh, well, geez, they went to Harvard. They must be awesome. Well, yeah, maybe. Maybe daddy just had a little trust fund going and, made a big donation. I don't know, right? So, you look for these markers, bilingual, previous experience in a role, most of which turn out to be not that all great as a predictor. The best predictor for whether someone's going to be a good hire or not is actually in general intelligence. What we should be doing is just giving everybody an IQ test, right? And then doing a behavioral assessment on them to see if they're a good fit culturally. Walk away. That's your best predictor. But instead, we look for all these markers because we don't want to make a bad hiring decision. But the more markers somebody has, guess what? They cost more, right? Whereas you might have Sally, who's been doing an awesome job for 5 years and is chomping at the bit for a new opportunity, but you don't hire her because she doesn't have those markers. Even though, if you step back and look at what you know about her, you know that she's actually a great fit, right? But again, we're leaning, the pendulum is too far to the right in terms of hiring from outside. So here we are. Firms can't find the critical talent they need. They spend crazy money searching. So do yourself a favor, cozy up to your recruiting people and get some idea what it costs to bring a new hire on board, or do the research yourself. Crazy money. Recruiting dollars, external firms you paid to get access to candidate pools. I mean, it's big. Onboarding time. Yet, in the end, we're paying more often for less than we would get if we brought people up internally. And the problem's really only going to get worse, right? I mean, just think of all the data I just gave you at the beginning. I did that so you wouldn't think this is a temporary thing, right? This is going to be a thing for the next 10 to 20 years, at least, where we're going to have these skill mismatch problems. We're going to have people coming up for the next 10 years who don't have the skills they need. We have to find a way to invest in capability development to grow our own critical roles and build out our own talent pools. I'd even go so far as to say one of the things that you could do that would be very interesting is think about the way that you could apply your internal training to an external talent pool. How could you grow your own candidates, right? If you're in an industry where it's difficult to get highly qualified people to come in, why not expose your training outside? Let them train themselves on their own dime. And when they pass some of your assessments or accreditations or whatever you're going to do, now you've got someone who's demonstrated commitment, they've showed drive, and they've showed that they have the capability or are willing to learn at least to come in. How cool would that be, right? So instead of just killing recruiting, maybe you could find a way to partner with them, right? And provide more value in the candidate pipeline. So what does that all mean to you? This is like really long. I put it in here because I assume we're going to push out the slides. I don't expect you to read it, so I'll read it to you. By the way, this is such a weird thing because I wrote a research paper on this like 3 years ago, or this similar subject, and BCG just came out like literally this year with a big paper on this. And Conference Board is also doing something on reskilling. So if this is a topic you're very interested in, Conference Board's got a whole ongoing series about reskilling as well. But anyway, it made me feel validated because a lot of the conclusions they came to were the same ones I came up with a couple years ago. I'm not saying that they copied me, but. So companies should forecast on a job family basis how their current workforce will develop over the next 5, 10, and 15 years, taking into account expected recruitment, retirement, and retention. Next, companies should simulate different strategic scenarios to determine the number and type of human resources that their business will demand on a job family level over the same period. Once companies calculate the difference between their expected demand for and supply of labor, they should take dedicated steps to address anticipated shortfalls and surpluses. Make sense? So what do we need? What do we have? Oh my God, there's a gap. What do I do? Okay? These steps include redeploying surplus resources to critical functions that are being drained of human resources, boosting internal training so that the current workforce can adapt and shift as necessary, or even attracting and retaining retired or semi-retired workers in areas with identified future shortfalls. I hope you heard in there a lot of the same things I did, which is, that sounds like training, right? There's a real strategic value in us addressing some of these things. So take the first one, redeploying surplus resources to critical functions that are being drained of human resources. Okay, well, that first question is, how do I know who to move, right? Who's the near fit for the thing that we have a gap against? How do we know who's a near fit? Today, the companies largely rely on performance management systems and things like that to know what skills and capabilities people have. I think you could just as easily get that through accreditation models within a learning management system to say these GLP completions equal this level of capability, assuming that you're doing behavioral assessments and not just knowledge assessments. And along the way, you could say this collection of stuff is the collection of capabilities I think we need, and so has them. They're at least worth looking at as a near fit candidate, right? That's partly in your world. What do we do to get them all the way there? To overcome the gap between what they have that's a near fit and what they need? Training, right? These are the capabilities we need you to have. These are the ones you do have. Train on the gap in order to help us overcome the skill challenges that we have. Boosting internal training so that the current workforce can adapt and shift as necessary. Again, how do you identify the best candidates to adapt and shift? You need to know what they can do today, and you need to know the gap against where you need them to go. And then how do you develop these new capabilities? Training and development, right? Again, in your wheelhouse. And then lastly, when you bring back all those retirees who loved golfing and sailing and now you're telling them to work more, I mean, hopefully they've decompressed a little bit. You got to bring them back up to speed about what's going on in the business, you know, what's changed since they've left. Again, training and development. So there's a massively important role that you need to play as we address these systemic skill shortages and skill gap kind of issues. You know, it used to be when we talked about talent that your choices were build, buy, or rent, right? So I can build my own talent internally, I can go acquire it or hire it, or I can effectively rent it through contractors or third-party relationships or business process outsourcing or things like that. Now it's starting to change a little bit. You got things like virtualize the work. So I can tap into pools of talent who live in Romania or Argentina. And increasingly, technology lets you virtualize more and more things to tap into talent pools where they are. And we also now more and more companies are dealing with talent mobility, like moving people. So I have talent abundance in area 1 and I have talent scarcity in area 2. Can I just move those people and overcome that gap? And increasingly, when you read the work of Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Accenture, Deloitte, Burson, they're all talking about this challenge. And they're all basically saying the same thing, is which companies that figure this out sooner will have a strategic edge on those that don't. Those companies that figure out how to respond with talent in response to strategic shock or strategic opportunity will have a much easier time navigating the next 20 years. Because there will be a tsunami. There will be a Fukushima. Did I say that right? Yeah, I don't know. There will be other disruptions technologically, business-wise, that we have to deal with. So the faster we can get at being agile in response to them with our talent, the faster we can address them. Now, I just go back to the opening remarks. We can have all the plans in the world, but if we don't have the people who can execute those plans, what do you do? How do we address the problem? I think there's really 5 steps. Know the team you have, know the team you need, invest in long-term capability development strategies, which, by the way, I think goes, you know, think like you're building a surgeon, or think like you're building a pilot, right? Think like you're building a leader. You know, we don't assume we're going to train a leader and be done. Leadership development's a thing. But when we think about building a senior programmer, how many people do that? Or think about building a principal sales person or a lead solution consultant, how often do we think about the long-term scaffolding of skill development? I think we need to think of a lot of critical roles, just like the way we think about leadership development or, you know, developing surgeons or things like that. We need to empower our workforce to take ownership on some of this, and I think we need to really quickly switch the default, which, by the way, would give us more budget and a bigger seat at the table at the executive level. So in terms of knowing the team, I mean, here's some things I think we should know, and this means partnering up with other members of your talent team to create a big data strategy around your people, right? So job history, work experience, expertise that I've developed outside of work. We were doing a green initiative at Taleo and looking for external consultants. We had people internally who were expert at that stuff, but they did it on their spare time, so no one at the company knew it. I hired a guy one time, really good dude, good at his job. We're having a big conference, this is back when I was at learn.com, and we're trying to figure out if we can afford to have somebody come in and videotape and stream the whole thing. And I'm complaining in a meeting about this. And this guy, Paul's like, well, I'll do it. I was like, well, what? I mean, you'll do it. Well, in his side business, he was a video production specialist. He had a side business, well, that's what he did. He had green screens, he had contracts with websites to do streaming media, and he did it all for us basically at cost, and all I had to do was give up his time for a couple weeks to work on the project. Probably saved us $200,000 or $300,000. But again, we wouldn't have known it because there's nowhere in his work catalog of skills, right? Self-identified area of expertise, career aspirations, top performers, flight risk, retirement plans. You know, we need a big data approach. And we need a data accountability approach. And I think that's one of the things that differentiates us from IT or marketing. When you think about where marketing was 10 years ago, marketing professionals at 10 years ago were where we are today. They were struggling to get a seat at the table. None of us remember that because marketing has a seat at the table today, a big one. But you know how they got there? Data. They had data about what they did. They had ROI. They understood the business impact. They could measure it. And this is where we need to get to, and I think big data strategies give us an opportunity to do that. What percentage of companies do you think know who's a flight risk? You can answer it either way. What percent? So let's answer, how many companies don't know who a flight risk is inside their company? Guesses, just shout them out. 80, that's a good guess. How about companies who don't know who's on a succession plan? About the same? Think they're all probably about the same? This was research I conducted as head of Taleo research. We basically asked people, what kind of data do you have, and what kind of data do you aspire to? Look at these numbers. 80% of companies don't know who's a flight risk. 65% of companies don't know much about who they're retaining. 84% of companies don't know if their development plans are working. 80% of companies don't know who has a career path. We're not good at measuring this stuff. And until we get good at measuring this stuff, we don't know what capabilities people have. We therefore can't earn a seat at the table to make strategic recommendations about how we develop the capabilities we need and what the gap looks like. Furthermore, when you ask the employees themselves, again, this is research I did back in my Taleo days, 48% said their skills go unnoticed in the workplace. 48% of the people have skills that they don't bring to the table at work. 75% have said their work history or experiences aren't leveraged by their employer. These are crazy numbers, right? But again, we can't know our capability gaps unless we have a full picture. The other thing we've got to think about is how we get from here to there. We have to understand the capability requirements of the business. We have to be at the table when we're talking about strategic plans, geographic expansions, acquisitions, all these sort of things, shifts in strategic direction. All of these things have a talent component and a training and development component that we need to take advantage of and be part of. We have to look at the gaps on those things, figure out what we're missing, and then assess the best approach to fill them in. Hire, contract, outsource, do skill and capability development, right? So if these conversations aren't happening, I think you can take a role in helping to drive some of these discussions and take a more strategic role on what we can do to impact the business and take more ownership of that discussion. One of the biggest gaps between what people want to know and what they actually know when it comes to talent is the competency skill gap analysis. So when we polled 550 companies in Europe and the US, what do you wish you knew and what do you actually know? Those are the two things we asked. What do you aspire to know? What do you actually know? Nearly 60% of companies said, boy, I really wish I knew where we have competency gaps. The other 40% of the companies, why they wouldn't want that, but that's okay. So 60% said, wow, that's really important. Around 21, 22% of companies actually had access to the data. It's like a massive gap between the desire for it and the actual tracking of it, which again, I think presents opportunity to you all to make yourselves part of that dialogue and part of that discussion. I think we also have to look at the long-term roadmap, right? What's the relationship between various roles and job families and the capability that you're building within the business? What roles commonly lead to other roles? You know, when I fill my TurboTax data out at the end of the year, I can look and see what other filers like me look like. And that's how I know if I've cheated too much on my taxes or just enough, right? Because I figure if I look like everybody else, I'm less likely to be audited, right? Now, I'm sure that's not how they intended that. But wouldn't it be cool if, as an employee, I could see, man, John's awesome. How did John get there? What path did he follow? Or what's the typical path? Or as a development person focused on career and development, what's the average path? What's the normal path? What are 2 or 3 deviant paths that go from here to here? So that I'm thinking about scaling Sally to grow from where she is to be a senior person of X, Y, and Z. What's the best way to get her there on average, right? Further, you know, what did the top performers do to get there? What are the skills, knowledge, experiences, job rotations required to get there? What roles have similar characteristics with other roles? In my career, I've been a VP of product management, a VP of product marketing, a head of Taleo research, a senior SC, And some people who don't know those roles think, whoa, that's weird. But actually, they're all really related. There's like a core skill set within those, and there's some bubbly stuff on the outside edges, but it's enabled me to transition between 4 or 5 careers because the job families are similar and the overlaps are similar. And then I think, as I said earlier, I just think we have to think differently about critical and strategic roles. Start thinking about scaffolding, start thinking like we're training a surgeon, start thinking about what it is to be, you know, a leader and do leadership training. And this stuff already exists. You know, we have competencies, we have capability modeling within the business. We just have to think about it, I think, in a slightly different way. We also want to get the teams involved in modeling what is required for their roles, what capability is necessary. Let them do it. You know, one of the challenges with competency and capability modeling is that we do it, right? And it's a whole lot of work. Why not crowdsource that? Let the team do some of that work. And then we would then figure out how do we connect the dots back to the learning interventions. What learning interventions are best to deliver what sort of capabilities and what sort of experiences. Again, that gives us an opportunity. And then lastly, you know, as I mentioned, I think we just got to switch our default. We got to take pressure off of those recruiting guys and put more energy and effort in building long-term, scalable, capable development plans that get people from a novice to an experienced person. And as I mentioned, you know, that means that we have to have our stuff together and that we have to have all of our plans and structures in place so that we can make that transition. So just to wrap, you know, all this stuff is happening now. I mean, senior leaders, when you talk to them, these are the things that they're thinking about, and these are the challenges that they're facing. And I think they're really having a hard time, if you look at the data, in sort of reconciling how to go forward. Recruiting isn't working. It's going to work decreasingly well in the future because of some of the challenges I mentioned. Our only choice is to sort of shift our focus to internal capability development in the long haul. And in doing so, we solve the problem of hiring for critical roles, and we have a clearly defined model on which we can reskill somebody. We'll just jump on at this point and then follow that same path toward capability development. So with that, I think I'm done. Thank you all very much for your time.